So just a little bit about me and what my job is at the University of Florida. So the University of Florida is a land-grant institution, which simply means that we have 3 responsibilities. And we're one of the only universities, Florida A&M, for example, has some land-grant responsibilities. As a result, we're one of the couple of universities in the state who have actually a mandate, a responsibility to go out into the public and do things for the public. All right? We call that extension. So there's 3 things that faculty members do at the University of Florida, and we all do some combination of the 3, whether it be one of those things, 2 of those things, or all 3 of those things. And they actually give us formal appointments in each of those 3 areas. The first of those, when you think of a professor, the most common question that you might know that I get is, what do you teach? And when I tell them nothing, their mind melts down, because most people think of professors as teachers, which is really the way most people have interacted with professors, right? You've been in their classroom watching one do this, right? And so that is 1/3 of what we do at the University of Florida. Those people who do the teaching full-time are our instructors, all right? So we have some faculty members with instruction appointments, some faculty members with research appointments, right? We're scientists. So the scientists in the group do research, right? And that could be social scientists, in my case an entomologist, so I do entomological research, so I do science, right? So science, teaching, and extension is what I'm doing right now. Extension is the one that is most confusing to people, but it's also the one that you see us doing, right? How many of you are familiar with the 4-H program? The 4-H program is run by the University of Florida Extension Service. In fact, the way it works, the way it's supposed to work in the state, not the way it works, but the way it's supposed to work, is every county in the state of Florida has extension agents. There's an ag agent, a hort agent, a 4-H agent, etc. Those individuals usually have split salaries, some combination of some paid by the state and some paid by the county. So if you send your kids to 4-H, the 4-H agents are technically employees of the University of Florida and the county where they work. Does that make sense? So the way it's supposed to work is if people have an ag-related question or a hort-related question or a 4-H-related question, they go to their local county agent who's an expert in that county. If the county agent, any county agents in here, county faculty in here? If the county agent doesn't know the answer, they go to the state specialist who resides at the University of Florida. That's my job, right? County agents have to know a lot about a lot of things. I have to know a whole lot more about one thing. Make sense? So if you call your ag agent about citrus, if they can answer it, they will. If they can't, they're going to call the citrus Jamie at the University of Florida. If you call your county agent about turf grass problems in your backyard, if they can answer it, they will. If they can't, they're going to call the turf grass Jamie at the University of Florida. Does that make sense? So as part of my extension responsibilities, I train beekeepers, develop lectures, put together bee colleges and master beekeeper programs and all of those kinds of things. So really, extension is the public face of what professors at land-grant institutions do. So I could give you a talk where I talk about the extension and the research and the teaching that we do out of my lab. So it's my lab's job to develop programming in those 3 areas, all related to bees. Make sense? So how many of you are in our master beekeeper program? All right, how many of you have come to our bee colleges before? All right, how many of you have seen some informational document or video that we've posted online out of our website? All of that stuff is extension. That's all what we do to train beekeepers around the state. And the more we do extension, the more we get requested to do extension. Literally, I'm speaking to you tonight. I'm speaking to the Green Cove Springs beekeepers on Monday night. I was in Italy last week speaking to Italian beekeepers. It's just nonstop. We're nonstop traveling and training and teaching about bees. So this is 1/3 of my job. All right? All right. So now I'm going to do the 1/3 of my job telling you about the biology of honeybees and why it's relevant to you as beekeepers. There are some things in here you won't know, but I guarantee you everybody's going to learn at least something. Guaranteed. If you tell me you know everything in this talk, you're a liar.
How do you spell honeybee?
All right, we'll start at the beginning.
How do
You spell honeybee with 2 words. That's important. You don't actually learn that in this lecture, so that's free information. So I'm going to tell you, since he asked a question on the front end, honeybee is correctly spelled 2 words. So I'm not going to look at your t-shirts or your literature or your websites because I don't want to know. But honeybee is correctly spelled 2 words. There's a reason for that. Believe it or not, there's an entomological nomenclature committee who's responsible for producing the common names of insects. And the general rule of thumb is every new insect has 2 parts to their common name. One part which is taxonomically correct, bee. One part that is a descriptor, honey. If the taxonomic part is what the insect actually is, it's 2 words, otherwise it's 1 word. Let me explain. Butterflies are not flies. It's 1 word. Ladybugs are not bugs. They're beetles. It's 1 word. Dragonflies are not flies. It's 1 word. Honeybees are bees. It's 2 words. Americans know that. The rest of the world does not. In fact, your spell check doesn't know that. Spell check almost always corrects it to 1 word, but it is correctly spelled 2 words. There you go. Free information. See, you learned something, unless you already knew that, in which case I got to work harder on subsequent slides. All right. So we're going to start kind of at the beginning where we talk about this, and a lot of you know this or know of this or know some rudimentary things about this, and based on the questions I was being asked out there at the beehives, that's why I decided to give this talk. In essence, we're going to start at the egg because it's just the cleanest place to start. Queen honeybees lay eggs. All right, there are 3 types of bees in the colony. There is the queen, there are workers, and there are drones. This is important because it affects everything else that comes up subsequently. And I never read my text, so I apologize in advance if I don't cover something that the slide says. If I don't cover something the slide says, you just got 2 pieces of information for the price of 1. All right? So queen bees, when they lay their eggs, can control whether that egg is fertilized or not. You're going to learn why in a moment. But in short, when queen bees mate, they store all of the semen from all the males that they mate with in a special organ in their body. And when they lay an egg, they release semen from that organ or withhold semen from that organ. If they withhold it, they lay an unfertilized egg. For you geneticists in the crowd, that means that that egg is haploid. It only has mama's DNA. It doesn't have daddy's DNA because there is no daddy. All right? And unfertilized eggs in the bee world become drones. So male honeybees come from haploid eggs. They come from unfertilized eggs. They have grandfathers but no fathers. All right? This is muy importante because it affects all kinds of things further down the line. Incidentally, this is a characteristic of all hymenopterans. For those of you who like free information, ants, wasps, and bees are all hymenopterans, and they all reproduce this way. So all of the males in ants, wasps, and bees come from unfertilized eggs, and all of the females, on the other hand, come from fertilized eggs. So when a queen's laying an egg, she releases semen, the egg gets fertilized, and that is where she loses control. Queens can control the sex of the egg, be it male or female. They cannot control whether it's a queen or a worker. That decision is up to the workers who take care of the larva that comes out of that fertilized egg. In short, if they feed it a lot, it becomes a queen. If they withhold food, it becomes a worker. In short, queens are overfed workers. Workers are starved queens. That's exactly what they are. And I don't know if you appreciate what I just told you, but this is, to me, one of the most fascinating things biologically. And I'm just going to throw it out there, and we can debate it all night. I was going to say I have nowhere to go, but I do have somewhere to go tonight. A friend of mine's I'd say he's in town. I'm actually in his town, so I'm going to go stay with him tonight. Anyway, so let me tell you something. Basically, queens and workers both have the potential to be the other, right? They have the same DNA in their body. But interestingly enough, morphologically, behaviorally, physiologically, almost all the ogicles, they are different. I mean, just to put it this way, workers will work themselves to death in summertime in about 6 weeks. If they live in a cool climate, they can live up to 6 months. Congratulations, they live six months. Queens, on the other hand, can live 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Same DNA in both of them, 2 completely different longevities. We call this epigenetics, above genetics. There are things deposited on the genes of queens and workers that are basically light switches for those genes. Those genes are either turned on or off. So basically, queens have the same DNA that workers do. They just have certain genes turned on and off. To give you a good example, a really good example, you oftentimes hear that humans and chimpanzees share 98% of our DNA, and it's the 2% that makes us different, right? Well, geneticists don't make that statement. That's what the general public says. They say it's the 98% being turned on and off that makes us different. We could make you hairy back scratchers if we wanted to, because we have the same DNA to be that way. It's amazing, but true. Anyway, so that's amazing if you think about it. It has all kinds of scientific implications. It has implications on aging, longevity, health, all kinds of things. So people study this phenomenon for 1,000 reasons related to this idea. All right? So how does all this happen in the first place? So we'll get there, I promise. So here's a queen bee. She lays all of the eggs in the colony, usually lays all the eggs in the colonies. Colonies often have only one queen per colony. The queen can lay 500,000 eggs over her 2 to 3 year lifespan. Yes, I think they've documented a queen that lived for 6 or 8 years before, but the average queen in the United States, at least according to the 3 different studies, lasts about 8 months to 1 year. And you argue to me, I've had queen in this colony forever, but unless you paint and mark your queen, you cannot know that with certainty. If you don't clip and mark your queen, you'll be surprised at how often they turn over in the nest. Sometimes it might be as little as 6 months that they're being replaced by a new queen. So long story short is, another thing that a lot of people don't know is that when they're looking in their colonies, they have this belief that all colonies only have one queen. But actually, a lot of colonies have 2 queens, and they don't know that. And the reason they don't know that is because when they find one queen, they stop looking. So we've done tremendous amount of work with observation hives, and probably in 20% of our observation hives, we see 2 queen systems. And that could be because the old queen's pheromone output is plummeted. The bees don't recognize her as a queen. The new queen doesn't recognize her as a queen. They made a new queen, and you've got 2 living together. But let's just say the books are right most of the time. And the books tell us there's one queen that lives 2 to 3 years, lays 500,000 eggs. This queen is producing, we call it a bouquet, a pheromonal bouquet of chemicals that are emitted from her body that causes the colony to do what it's supposed to do. It's important to know the queen does not govern the nest. Her presence provides homeostasis, right? I have 4 kids. I got there by having a wife. And my wife and I, when she's around, it just seems to be a lot easier to take care of the kids, right? And when she's gone, like the homeostasis is broken in the house, and I just feel like I'm an uphill battle trying to control the 4 kids. Anybody been there? Well, it's a lot like that. When the queen is present, she's not making any decisions, but her mere presence and releasing this pheromone is telling the other workers that we have a queen, we do these tasks. All right? Interestingly enough, when I was mentioning this outside, queens typically start laying, usually, this is a general rule of thumb, in the center combs in the middle of the comb. And they will usually spiral out from that center pivot position laying eggs. So she'll start laying eggs here and then just kind of go in a spiral like this. Generally speaking, if you look at it, if you look at the combs in the middle of the nest, the most amount of baby bees, we call that brood, eggs, larvae, and pupae are collectively referred to as brood. Most of those combs in the center of the nest have the most brood, and as you move to the edges of the nest, that brood pattern decreases. In essence, queens lay a spherical pattern. As I was telling the outside group, imagine this. Basically, queens produce basketball patterns of brood. Okay? And that's exhibited here. Around that basketball of brood, you get a layer of pollen, which is what I've highlighted in yellow here on these frames. And then above that, they pack the honey. So to help you think about it, imagine having in that bottom box of your beehive a basketball, and then that basketball has a jacket that covers its top half, and that jacket is pollen, and then everything above that jacket's honey, and that's the typical construction of a nest for a honeybee colony, right? In the summertime or in the springtime when the colony is exploding in population, you may have wall-to-wall brood, in which case she's maxing out her brood pattern. But for the most part of the year, she has this kind of spherical pattern. So incidentally, when a queen first begins laying eggs in the middle, the babies in the middle are older than the babies on the edge. So these emerge first. She starts back over laying eggs in the middle and spirals her way out, and that's the pattern that it creates. Beekeepers, myself included, refer to the pattern with which a queen lays as her brood pattern, right? Generally speaking, queens that miss few holes have solid brood patterns, and queens that miss a lot of holes have spotty brood patterns. Some people call them shotgun brood patterns. A lot of the old timers do that. So that doesn't mean necessarily that a queen failed to lay an egg. The number one cause, at least 10 years ago, the number one believed cause of spotty brood pattern was actually inbred queens. So the queen could actually be the best egg-laying queen on the planet. She's just producing inbred eggs, and the workers can detect that and abort the eggs. How that happens, more later. Stay tuned. So you can't just look at this and say, I have a sorry queen. You can just say she might have mated sorry. Or there could be pesticide residues in the comb, or there could be pathogens in the comb, etc. But not, 10 years ago, the number one belief for this was poor mating, which is why if you have one colony in your backyard and no bees around, and you allow your colony to requeen itself, guess who she's going to mate with? More on that later. All right? So this is a typical brood pattern of a queen. Drones really have two functions in life. Eat, and they eat so they can mate. Okay. There's a couple of chucklers. Look, I work for the state. I cannot make any off-color comments. But I know I've heard them all from the crowds over the years of giving this talk. A lot of ladies say, well, what's different than my husband? Well, the difference is that colonies produce about one queen for every 2,000 to 10,000 drones they produce. So statistically, only about 1 in every 2,000 to 3,000 drones actually mates. So the vast majority of drones simply eat their whole lives, fly to find girls, can't find them, and die. That's the fate of most of the drones. But if you're one of the 2,000, you'll mate with the queen, and we'll talk about that on subsequent slides. So if you look at the drones, how are they built? Well, drones have really reduced mouth parts. They can't even really feed themselves well. They can a little bit. Generally speaking, their sisters have to feed them. Drones' small mandibles can't work wax. They don't have pollen baskets. They can't do anything. They don't have stingers. They can't even protect the hive. All they can do is eat and wait for their chance to mate. And incidentally, their most notable characteristic is their big eye, or are their big eyes. And why do you think that's the case? The better to see the queen. The better to see her with, right? And why do they need big eyes? Because they mate in the air, which we'll learn about momentarily. So, drones are so useless, in fact, during the off-season, that the females consider them a resource sink, and the females push them out of the colonies, and they starve to death outside the colonies, which is what you see happening here. The drones have been pushed from the colonies. The workers will not let the drones come back in, and the drones don't survive the winter. You see this a lot in temperate climates. You may never see it down here. Usually drone populations just dwindle down here, but where it actually gets cold for winter, they'll do this behavior very commonly. So the drones will get kicked out and not allowed into the colonies. Usually late in the summer and by fall, the drones are on the outer edges of the box anyway, because the workers are starting to push them to the perimeter of the nest and are reducing the food that they give them. So workers, like the name implies, they do the work in the honeybee colonies. Queens lay eggs. Drones look for queens. Workers do everything else. Workers are the bees that the general public encounters on flowers when they're being stung. It's the bees that when you open the box, that's most of what you see. Workers typically do not lay eggs if a healthy queen is present, but workers are females. So if a colony loses its queen and fails to requeen itself, some workers' ovaries can develop and they can begin laying eggs, but workers cannot mate. So workers can only produce drones. So when a colony has laying workers, the colony is doomed because drones do nothing except look for queens. So when you lose a queen, workers start laying eggs, they will not requeen themselves because those workers who are beginning to lay eggs start producing kind of a rudimentary pheromonal bouquet of a queen. The colony thinks it has a queen. So you're feeding in new queens and the bees are destroying them as quickly as you're giving them to them because they think they have a queen. Laying worker colonies can be difficult to deal with. If you've ever had this problem before, we can talk at the end about how to remedy it. There is one subspecies of worker honeybee. This is absolutely free information tonight. There is one subspecies, and scientists use the word subspecies, humans use the word race. Just like there are different races of people in this room, there are different races of this one honeybee that we use. There is one race, the Cape honeybee in Africa. When their colony goes queenless and they fail to produce a new queen, their workers can begin laying eggs, but their workers can lay diploid eggs without mating. All right? It's fascinating, but I'll tell you how it happens. Basically, during the process of producing haploid eggs, right? You know, the mommy's half and the daddy's half equals a whole. In the process of producing a haploid egg, there is a process during which half of the DNA migrates to the edge of the nucleus and just becomes inactive. We call that a polar body. And basically what happens is when a Cape worker lays an egg, that polar body reactivates, comes back down and fuses with the nucleus, and you have both the sets of chromosomes only from the worker. So the worker's basically fertilizing herself inside of the cell, right? And she's basically producing a clone of herself as a result of that. So Cape bees can produce clones of themselves, and they can even make queens from the female eggs that they produce, although they don't want to, since they've got workers laying eggs, and those workers smell like queens. You want to hear something that's even more fascinating? At least it's fascinating to me, maybe not to you. In these colonies of Cape bees where the queen dies and the workers start producing eggs, there's usually more than one laying worker. So let's just make it easy math for my small brain. Let's say there's 5 laying workers. These 5 laying workers produce offspring, right? And each laying worker's offspring knows who their mama is. And to make it even cooler, they know who their mama's eggs are. So they can selectively remove their aunt's eggs in favor of their mama's eggs in the colony. We call that policing. So within a living hive that's one colony of bees, you can have 5 different families, each fighting for different territory within the nest. It's a lot like the mafia, right? Just fighting to own the colony, right? It's just like that in Cape bees. All right, fascinating. That goes on in our boxes, crazy stuff. Anyway, so now I recognize there are young ears in here, so I'm going to use the science terms so that we can all keep up with it, but just bear with me. I've got to get you to how this happens in the first place. And it's real simple. Simple. Drones have an endophallus. Like the name implies, endo, it is inside the body. Unless you look at external anatomy, there's nothing that's externally different between males and females. Their reproductive organs are not outside their body. Let's just say it that way. So the endophallus is inside the body. In order for a drone to push out his endophallus, basically, almost all of the blood in his body is needed to push out that endophallus. A bee's blood is called hemolymph, and from this point forward, that's what I'm calling it. So basically, you see him partially everted there. This is him fully everted. The fact that it takes all of his hemolymph means that he becomes paralyzed in this process. All of his blood is here. Very shortly after copulating, he dies because he has no circulation running through his body. You're going to see this in just a minute. So how that happens is it all happens on the fly, in the air. This is the internal anatomy of a queen. Queens have 2 ovaries that are made up of lines of tissue called ovarioles. If you look in here, what do these little pieces of the ovarioles look like? Eggs. Basically, the immature eggs are born here, and as they migrate down these ovarioles, they become mature eggs. And when it's time to lay an egg, she passes one down this oviduct, and so these are called lateral oviducts. They go to either ovary. So this time this one might produce the egg, this time this one might. And when the egg gets right here, she has that organ called a spermatheca that's got semen in it. We're going to talk about how it gets there in a moment. She has a valve here that she can open and control the flow of that semen to meet the egg right here at this oviduct. So on its way out, she can fertilize it or withhold the semen. All right? All that happens here. If you take out a spermatheca of an unmated queen, it looks like a crystal ball. It's got no semen in it. If you take out a spermatheca from a mated queen, it's a cloudy crystal ball. It's got semen in it. Something that you may not appreciate yet. Queens mate the first 10 days of their life and then never again. So if a queen is laying eggs 2 years later, the workers who are being born, his father lived and died 2 years ago. So she's producing offspring from someone who has been dead for years. And when humans study semen and try to keep semen alive, we almost always do it cryogenically. We've yet to be able to just put it in something and keep it alive by nourishing it. Spermatheca are covered in these tracheal nets. What do trachea do in organisms? Carry oxygen, right? So you can see that tracheal net around that spermatheca, and without it, the purpose of that tracheal netting is to deliver oxygen to that resource sink, the spermatheca, keeping alive all of that sperm. It's pretty amazing, huh? All right. So that's the queen's internal anatomy. How does everything meet? Well, as I shared, it happens in the air. Let's just do simple biology. What would happen if a queen mated in the nest? Who'd she mate with? Her brothers. Exactly. Mama dies. They produce a new queen out of the first fertilized egg they can find. There are drones in the nest. And the mama of the egg and the mama of the drones are the same mama. So the queen only has her brothers available in the nest to mate with. So mating does not happen in the nest. It happens in the air about 2 kilometers away from the hive at about 10 meters in the air, so 30 feet in the air, plus or minus a few feet. And so what happens is, this is absolutely fascinating to me. Queen bees and drones meet at areas where drones hang out. These areas are called drone congregation areas. So we abbreviate them DCAs. Interestingly enough, all the colonies in the area tend to use the same 2 or 3 DCAs. All the drones just know where to go. They just know. They look for the same things. They go to the same things. You want to make it more fascinating? We could find the DCAs around here, take away all the colonies for 10 years, move back in new colonies, and those drones are going to use the same spots. Because what some like, they all like. So drones, every day of their mature lives, go out of their colonies and hang out at DCAs, waiting for queens. The vast majority of their life, they never get a queen. Thousands, up to 10 or 15,000 drones will be hanging out at these DCAs. All right, so one queen, a virgin queen, is born. She flies out of the colony, goes to these DCAs, and while she's in the DCA, and incidentally, she flies about 10 minutes to the DCA and 10 minutes back. She spends about 5 to 10 minutes at a DCA, physically there. She's got about 30 minutes of energy to get back and forth to the DCA. All right, 10 there, 10 back, 10 while present. All right? During that 10 minutes of presence at the DCA, she flies through and drones just chase her. We call that a drone comet, where the drones will coalesce and follow the queen. The fastest drone catches her, mounts her, mates with her, falls backwards paralyzed. When she's done with him, she drops him to the ground. The next drone takes his place, does the same thing. Literally, she spends about 2 seconds per drone, is done in 10 minutes, and never mates again. And that's important because this is new and relatively new information. What happens when a drone mates with a queen, and what you see here is a queen being caught by a drone. You can see a drone here in the process of everting his endophallus. Am I disguising it enough, parents? All right, hopefully so. Everting his endophallus. Look, so you can see the queen tethered here. The drone's everting his endophallus. And what's interesting about this is that most you seasoned beekeepers are going to know a piece of the rest of this story. A drone, when he is finished mating and falls backwards to the ground, leaves something in the queen. What do we call that? The mating sign. If you read about it in the books, they call it the mating sign. The mating sign threw off beekeepers for centuries because they would see queens come back to the nest with a mating sign, and they'd say, okay, the queen can't take that mating sign out by herself. Therefore, she goes into the nest, workers take it out, and she goes back out and mates again. So the average queen mates with 10 or 15 drones. So she'll make 10 or 15 flights over the course of a week, and that's how she mates. But that's actually not true. What they have discovered by filming this process is that the next drone part of his endophallus is especially designed, and his fall back yanks out the mating plug of the previous drones, leaves his own mating plug in there. And you might say, why in the world would this be adaptive? And what they've shown is queens with mating plugs are more likely to be found by drones than queens that are not. So literally, the previous drone is helping the subsequent drone successfully mate with the queen. And you say, that's stupid. That's against biology. Until you remember, the more drones a queen mates with, the healthier and more long-lived the colony. So it benefits drones to help their subsequent suitors. It's kind of crazy biology, but it happens. And so what's interesting in this whole process is what happens is when beekeepers were seeing queens come back to the colony with a mating plug, that was just the last drone. There were no other drones to take out the plug. She can't remove it, so the workers in the nest have to remove the last one. At most, she'll go on about 2 mating flights. The vast majority of them do this all in one mating flight in one day, which is relatively new information to most beekeepers, because we always assume that she just went on multiple mating flights for about a week, which is why weather is so important and drones are so important. That 10 minutes, she's at a DCA that will direct the future of your colony forever, right? So it's pretty amazing to think about. So basically you see a queen here, her ovaries are spermatheca, the endophallus is depositing the semen. I've got a video. All right, so there she is flying to a DCA. That's a real queen, but maybe not a correct flight. That's the drone. Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you how this happened in a minute. There's no need for sound. It's in German. Thank you, though. I appreciate the try. All right, so this is a drone looking for a queen. I want you to notice something about the queen when it's getting close to happen. You see how she opens up to be receptive? You see that? She has opened up her sting chamber. The drone catches, mounts, falls over paralyzed. He is now paralyzed. You can see his endophallus depositing the semen. He is about to fall down. He's dead now. That's it. 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Done. Dead. He's dead. And literally, if you watch this at a DCA with multiple drones present, there's already a drone on top of her when the other one falls down. I mean, it's 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds, done. You know, that's it. It's a fascinating biology. I think you will agree. And every honeybee colony in the United States does this. So all of your queens fly to DCAs to be mated with drones that are at DCAs waiting for them. Absolutely fascinating. At least it is to me. Everybody gets fascinated by different things, I suppose. X, bring it back over here. So because of this unique mating system, everybody in the colony's got the same mama, but let's just say she mates with 10 drones. Then there's a 1 in 10 chance that any 2 workers have the same father. So because of this peculiar mating system, you get a huge diversity of genes that are circulating through the nest. Again, they all have the same mama, but lots of different dads. And that's beautiful. That's the beauty of honeybee colonies, because there's no doubt a drone that contributed susceptibility to nosema genes. So when nosema comes into the colony and wipes out that 1/10 of the population, there's some bees that can survive. There's bees that are better producers, or bees that are better pollen foragers. So no matter what the colony is hit with, they generally have the correct workers in the nest to overcome that issue, unless we super stress them, which is what we do. But another story for another day. So that's how we all get to bees in the first place.
Danny,
It's absolutely fascinating. Yes, sir.
when she's fertilizing eggs, has any research been done on that sperm is all mixed together?
Oh, great question. Well, question was, when she's fertilizing eggs, has there been any research done on is that semen all mixed together? So I'm going to tell you more than you need to know. Number one, there's a book that just came out that explains this whole thing and the answers in that book. And the reason I know the answers in that book is I wrote the book, co-wrote the book. All right. Number two, which is why I know a lot about this. Number two, the answer to that question is, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but the average spermatheca can hold about 1 million sperm, 600,000 to 1 million sperm. The average drone deposits 600,000 to 1 million sperm. So technically, it only takes 1 drone to fully fill their spermatheca. And what happens is when drones are mating with her for those 10 minutes, she goes back to the colony, and for the next 48 hours, she has all the semen not in the spermatheca, but all in this cavity space here, in the oviducts and the lateral oviducts, the median oviducts. It's just sitting there, sort of mixing, and she's loading the spermatheca. And there's no benefit. There's been shown to be no benefit. Last drone does not have more semen in the spermatheca than the first drone. So in addition to that, about 24 to 48 hours later, she flushes the system and does away with 90 to 95% of the semen that she received. And then she stores the rest of it, 5 to 10% in that spermatheca. And when she's laying eggs the first few days, there appears to be clumping. It'll be eggs all sired by the same father. But a week later, there's pretty consistent mixing. And as she's laying, it appears to be pretty randomly distributed.
So if it's limited to that amount of semen, her space, and she mates with that many males, is that so that the genetics are mixed and the survival?
Sure. The question is if she only needs one male but mates with more is basically the summary of your question. Why is it because the genetics? So the question is anything in nature purposeful? But yes, the argument is yes, that's why it happens. Mating, the more males she mates with, the better survivability of that colony because of the diversity of genes to address the problems that come their way. So that's probably why it exists. All right, we got to move on. So assuming that all goes well, and about 20% of the time it fails, if you've ever let a colony requeen itself, you've discovered that, right? 10 to 20% of the time colonies fail to requeen themselves. Then you get the luxury of having to deal with laying workers. Let's just say this queen is mated. She's now sticking her head in the cell. She uses her antenna and her front legs to measure the diameter of the cell. That's important because the diameter of the cell tells her whether to lay a fertilized egg or an unfertilized egg. Big cells get drones, right? Haploid eggs. Small cells get workers. And so when she determines it's clean and the right size, she sticks her abdomen into that cell, which basically looks like this schematically. She puts it down the bottom, lays an egg. Out of that egg comes a larva 3 days later. The larva spends X amount of days as a larva. This is actually factually incorrect. Actually, factually. That was not on purpose. But anyway, basically during the uncapped stage, and you'll see it on a subsequent slide, the larvae lay in the bottom of that cell in the shape of a letter C. Beekeepers often call that C-shaped larvae. C-shaped larvae. When that larvae is finished eating, and that's all larvae do, they eat. They are eating machines. When they are finished eating, the bees will cap over that cell, and then it stands up. This is wrong. They don't stand up before they're capped. And you say, I've seen them stand up before they're capped. No, you've seen them be capped and then uncapped, and you're seeing them standing up. That's usually what happens in that case. And so under that capped cell, that larva stands up and becomes a prepupa, and then it becomes a pupa, starts to look like an adult bee, and 21 days later, it emerges as an adult bee if it's a worker. So this is what it looks like in the beauty of life. So egg, C-shaped larva. Another thing beekeepers call this is milk brood. The first couple of hours, maybe half a day to a day, that a female larva is in existence, she is treated as a female larva, not as a worker or a queen. So they tend to get a lot of food, and that food is brood food. You see that milky white substance, that is glandular secretions that the nurse bees secreted from their glands out of their mouth and into these cells, and the larvae just sit there and eat it. It's called milk brood because it looks like milk, right? C-shaped larvae, milk brood. They eat, 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 eat. That is all they do. When they are finished eating, they are capped over and then stand up. So this has been uncapped so you can see them standing up. This is the prepupal stage. When their bodies begin to differentiate, in other words, you start getting a head, a thorax, an abdomen, wings, and eyes, and ocelli, and antenna, etc. It starts from white to progressively darker and darker and darker. Their body is beginning to harden. Scientists call that sclerotize. So it turns black. And then once it's this progression, it emerges from the cell as an adult bee. All right?
So they're not spinning a cocoon?
There is silk produced in this stage. They don't spin a cocoon like a butterfly spins a cocoon. They just deposit silk everywhere. But it's not like a big, thick butterfly cocoon.
So the capping isn't silk?
There is some silk mixed in with the wax. Mm-hmm.
But they turn around.
Yeah, the capping gets cut out. Basically, when this female is ready to emerge, she cuts cuts the hole with their mandibles, and the capping gets thrown or potentially recycled, but thrown out mainly, and then the worker comes out, and then the new workers will secrete new wax. It's the old workers that produced this wax, and any silk would have been contributed from the bee when she finally stood up.
Yeah, but don't they produce the cocoon?
The immatures do.
No, they split around the
Yes.
the cocoon.
Yeah, but it's not a solid cocoon like a butterfly thing. It's more just a very big, loose collection of silk. It's kind of hard to explain. Imagine butterflies make chrysalis anyway, more like moths, but about half the amount of silk. It's not like this big, thick-walled cocoon like what we think of when we think of cocoons. So just to let you know, workers spend about 21 days in development, drones 24 days, queens 16. Why do they develop so quickly? You've got to remember one thing, they're being fed way more than anybody else, right? So a lot of food pushes them through development faster. But secondly, when colonies need queens, they need queens now. So life is favor the development of quick queens. And so interestingly enough, queens can be purposeful or just, oops, we need a queen. There are times when colonies purposely want to make queens even if they have queens, and there are times where they need to make queens because it's an emergency situation. We'll talk about both of those circumstances shortly. But in essence, when bees make a queen in an emergency situation, they'll pick young female larvae and begin to develop these wax cells. We call these queen cells. Some people say they look like peanut hole shaped things. Drones and workers develop in horizontally oriented cells. Queens develop in vertically oriented cells. All right, so if you can hold up a comb and look straight into it, it's a drone or a worker. Queens point down. So interestingly enough, queens are fed so much food they cannot eat it all. In fact, workers in some cases, here's the beginning of a queen cell. Oftentimes people call these queen cups. You can see the larvae are floating in a huge pool of royal jelly. Royal jelly is different than just straight up brood food. Remember, they all start off the same, and then the diet changes substantially. In addition to being more food, it is slightly different food. It is so much food that when the cells are capped and the prepupa stand up, there is leftover food. If you've ever gone into a queen cell and seen dried up, goopy, orangey brown stuff at the top, that's old royal jelly that they did not consume. Just as more information that's more than you'll ever need. When larvae are getting ready to do this, when they're getting ready to pupate, there's been debates for a long time on how worker bees know to stop feeding and start capping over that cell. And what happens is there's probably some pheromones produced by the grubs living in those cells that's saying, I'm ready to pupate, you don't have to do this anymore. But certainly another major signal is that they defecate when they're ready to pupate. So that's the scientific word for poo-poo, right? So they poo-poo when they're ready to turn into pupa. And there's a real simple reason for this. If you've ever heard me give this talk, you know why. But why do larvae not defecate until they're ready to pupate? Pardon? Bacteria? Keep their house clean? The short answer is they cannot defecate. And it's a real simple reason. Larvae, and if you've heard me give this talk, you won't be fascinated by it. All of life fascinates me. I just happen to be talking to you about bees. So I'll tell you something that is fascinating to me. Bees have three parts of their gut: a foregut, a midgut, and a hindgut. The foregut and the hindgut are lined with cuticle. The same stuff on the outside of their body lines the inside of those two parts of the gut. When larvae shed their skin, they also shed their foregut and their hindgut lining. Imagine a larva developing like this. Take a balloon and put your fingers on two different sides of the balloon and push them slowly to one another. When your fingers finally touch, the digestive system is connected from front to end. That is how the digestive system is created in a bee. It's not naturally just a long tube. Basically, the tube is growing this way and the tube is growing that way, and when they finally touch in the middle, then the food can pass out the anus. And that doesn't happen until they're ready to pupate. So at that time, it's just one massive defecation event, and they're done feeding. That's it. Because of that peculiarity, the midgut, that middle section, is not lined with cuticle. That is extremely important because proteins, minerals, nutrients, etc. cannot get through cuticle. So nutrient absorption happens in the midgut. It does not happen in the foregut and in the hindgut. Also because of that, that's where the viruses enter the blood and where nosema enters the blood. Nosema cannot go through the foregut or the hindgut. It has to go through the midgut into the blood. That's where the nutrients are absorbed, and that's where the pathogens invade the bee's blood. That's why the health of the midgut is extremely important in bees. Moving on. So looking at this frame has a lot of things. You can see drones here. Drones are built in, drone cells are bigger than worker cells. I don't know what statistically it is. It's probably, the cells are probably 1.25 times bigger than worker cells. You can see some normal looking worker cells here. These are drone cells. You see how much bigger they are? And drone cappings are usually very concave. A lot of people, in fact, call that bullet shaped. That's the common term you hear with drone cells, is they're bullet shaped. Imagine stacking a bunch of round tip bullets together and you can see the domed part of the tips, and that's what they claim about drones. Incidentally, we ask worker bees to produce worker comb. If you look at the foundation that we provide to colonies on which the bees build their wax, we are giving them 100% worker comb, right? If you leave bees to do what they want to do, about 20% of the comb that they build will be drone comb. So they produce a lot more drones in the wild than they do in our colonies, proportionately so. And incidentally, even if you give them 100% worker comb to build, they're going to find a way to make drone combs. They want to make them that bad. All right? So this frame has everything. Drone cells poking out at you, worker cells, the vast majority of it, queen cups, which are the beginning stages of queen cells. Queens may lay eggs in those. If they do, the bees will begin to pull that wax. That's another beekeeper jargon thing that we use a lot. They pull wax. So they're basically developing that cell down, queen cup, developing queen cell, nearly mature queen cell. The next step is for it to be capped over. All right? So those are queen cells, queen cups, drones, and workers. Now, workers. So we spent a lot on queens, a lot on drones, and now let's talk about workers because they're the ones that do everything that you need done in a colony, most of what you need done. So I always kind of start this part of my lecture mentioning to people that workers subscribe to temporal polytheism. And so everybody's scared of science words, but if you digest this, it's really not that hard. Temporal, time, poly, many. Most people don't know this one, but I'm sure someone here does. Ethology, ethism. I can see why you'd think that. But it's behavior. So timed, many behaviors. Beekeepers call this age-related division of labor. When a worker bee is born, she is not born into a task in which she remains her whole life. As she ages, the time part, she progresses from behavior to behavior to behavior. There are young bee behaviors, middle-aged bee behaviors, and old bee behaviors, right? Timed, many behaviors. Age-related division of labor. Incidentally, just to give you a funny story about how Latin science words are so fun, I'm being filmed, so I'm going to have to be careful about saying this. So just make sure it doesn't end up on the web. I have or if you do, you got to edit out this part. I got a cousin who has a maternal grandmother named Polly and a maternal grandmother named Andrea, a paternal grandmother named Andrea. So when she had a daughter, she named her Polyandria, which is good for most of the world. But scientists know that polyandry means female who has many males. Queens reproduce through polyandry. It's a female who has many males. So biologists just discover funny things about people's names a lot. So be careful what you name your kids, because I'll know. All right. So moving back to this, so temporal polytheism, this simply means that bees aren't married to a task that they remain in their whole life, right? They progress through a series of tasks. These are somewhat predictable, but contrary to popular belief, not all bees do all tasks. All right? They do progress through predictable tasks, but they don't go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Most might go from 1 to 3 to 4 to 6, and that part's not predictable. They do that based on the amount of other bees doing the other jobs. There's a lot of feedback mechanisms in the nest. If there's not any brood in the colony, then the young nurse bees have no jobs, so they jump to the next task. Make sense? So there's a lot of feedback systems in the colony to make sure what needs to be done is getting done. Incidentally, this protects colonies in another way. Imagine pesticides coming in and wiping out the field force in the colony. The field bees are the older bees. You usually have to be about 18 to 21 days old before you leave the hive to forage. So if you're getting out there and you're getting exposed to pesticides and it kills the entire 21 and older bee age, you kill the old folks in the bee world, basically you're only left with young folks. So in theory, biologically, those bees, those colonies should starve to death because they'd never foraged. But in reality, in the absence of those field bees, some bees that shouldn't be doing older bee jobs jump tasks because of the subconscious detection of the missing jobs. Likewise, if something wipes out the young bees, older bees that shouldn't be able to do young bee jobs are able to reverse tasks, and all of this is hormonally linked based on one hormone, juvenile hormone. The amount of juvenile hormone in the bee basically makes the bee do what it's supposed to be doing when it's supposed to be doing it. And how their hormone levels are regulated probably has to do with how many of their sisters are doing what jobs. But if they were to follow exactly all the tasks, these are the types of things they do: clean cells, cap brood, on down to foraging. So in general, the older they get, the more to the entrance of the hive they move. Young bees do stuff in the middle of the colony. As they radiate from the middle of the colony and ultimately leave the colony, they get older. For example, young bees clean cells, right? The first thing they do is get some food and go out and clean cells. Very quickly thereafter, usually about 5 or so days, 5 to 7 days, the first 5 to 7 days of their life, the workers eat a tremendous amount of bee bread. And the reason they do that is that nutrition helps their glands develop. And once their glands are fully developed, on average about 6 days, they are able to produce brood food, so they become the nurse bees that feed the baby bees. They can't do that before then. So the bees that are the adult bees that are the heaviest pollen consumers are the first 7-day-old bees, because they're eating pollen, maturing glands, until they can start feeding the babies. And worker bees and drones are not mass fed. Queens are fed so much they don't eat all their food, right? But workers are provisionally fed, which means these workers basically are at the point of starvation every 5 minutes. And literally hundreds of times, maybe a day, worker bees go into those cells and give them just enough food to keep them going. It's almost like controlled starving. It's a really weird system, control feeding in the worker world.
Jamie,
Yes, sir.
can we manipulate those hormone levels if we want the
Yep.
bees to become foragers?
The question was, can we manipulate hormone levels in bees to make them do crazy stuff? Yeah, that's what I did when I was a sophomore in high school. But other people do it too. In essence, there are people who, the glands that produce juvenile hormone, there's a paired gland. I'll talk to everybody and maybe not just you. There's a pair of glands at the base of the head called corpora allata. You can take those out of a living bee and them remain alive, so they're unable to produce juvenile hormone. And then you can dose them with juvenile hormone and make them go backwards and forwards, etc. And incidentally, this is more free information. It's probably juvenile hormone that makes them queens or workers. Because what happens is when they're eating a lot of royal jelly, there's a lot of sugar in royal jelly, which causes their corpora allata glands to overproduce juvenile hormone. So basically, you can take female larvae and give them a heck load of juvenile hormone and produce queens, or withhold the juvenile hormone and produce workers, which was my senior year science fair project. But the point is that hormone is super critical in all insects, but also specifically honeybees. Okay, maybe you're getting bored, so I need to kind of wind down. But in essence, bees, we're about halfway through the worker bee task. I'm going to kind of speed through the rest and get you to some other things. But most people know that there's probably a cohort of worker bees whose job it is to ripen the honey. Bees collect 4 things when they leave the nest: water, to drink or to thermoregulate the nest with. We'll talk about that momentarily. Tree saps or plant rosins, which they use in the nest as propolis. That's what beekeepers call that, propolis. And it's a lot, the books tell you that they use it to weatherproof, but what they really use it for probably is for pathogen control in the nest. They collect pollen, which they turn into bee bread. Bee bread they eat or feed to their babies. And they collect nectar, which is sugar water in flowers, which they turn into honey, which is what most people think about when they think about honeybees. Nectar has way too much water in it. Way too much water in it. It needs to be about 15.5 to 18.5% water to make it honey. It comes in 40, 50, 60% water, sometimes 70% water. So when bees deposit that nectar in the cells, it has to be dried off. So most people know that there will be worker bees that stand at the entrance of the nest and fan their wings, which circulates air in the nest, dries the water off of that nectar, dries it down, and produces honey, right? But most people don't know that there's a cohort of worker bees whose job it is, when a bee comes in with nectar, she meets her close to the entrance, takes that nectar from her, spits it out, sucks it in. Spits it out, sucks it in. Spits it out, sucks it in. And she does this for about 20 minutes to begin the evaporation process. That's active evaporation of the water off of that nectar. And then when she does this for 20 or so minutes, she'll actually deposit it into the cells to undergo a different type of evaporation where they're fanning their wings. And a lot of people debate, should I put my empty combs on top? Should I put my empty combs on the bottom? Well, if I put them on the bottom, the bees coming in with nectar can get to it quicker and get back out of the hive quicker. That's malarkey. Because the bees coming in with nectar don't deposit it into the cells. They give it to the nectar receivers, who then go deposit it in the cells. All right? There you go. All right. So there are pollen storage and bees that clean the colony. You can see it's technically incorrect to say bees eat pollen. They don't eat pollen. When they come in, they rake the pollen balls off their legs into the cells, and some other bees come and process it. They'll use their heads and their hands and etc. Their hands, their tarsi, to pack the pollen in there. And pollen is mixed with a little bit of nectar. There's some yeast in there. It undergoes lactic acid fermentation, and we call the end product bee bread. And that's what they consume. All right. That part of that process probably helps them break down the shells of the pollen, which the bees themselves have a hard time otherwise breaking down. As the bees get older, there are special glands on the underside of their abdomen. The abdomen is that third segment of the insect. Those special glands secrete the beeswax that they use to construct their nest. That's an interesting thing about bees, but honeybees specifically. Wasps, yellow jackets, hornets, paper wasps, etc., have to go chew wood or chew mud, depending on what type of wasp, to construct their nest. Paper nests are just made of wood. If you have any untreated wood outside and it's really rough after a couple of years, if you watch it during the summertime, you'll oftentimes see yellow jackets or hornets or wasps scraping wood off to chew it and make the paper. Well, bees, honeybees, secrete their nest. It literally, as sugar goes in, wax comes out. And they'll get those wax flakes and chew them up and shape them like what you see here into their comb. Then as they get a little older, usually around 18 days old, worker bees will start their orientation flights because they've never been out of the hive. They don't know where they live. And so they'll fly out, look around the colony and go back in. Fly out a little further, look around the colony and go back in. And they'll do this until they get some distance from the colony and learn, colony, tree, blah, 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 and that's how they use to orient their nest. So during this stage, they're very prone to drifting because they're not exactly sure where they are, and if there's a lot of colonies stacked side by side, they'll often go into the wrong colony in this process. Then they move to the guarding of the colony. Guard bees are the bees who stand at the entrance of the colony. They're first to come out after you if you just rub your finger on the entrance of the hive. Go try it sometime, you'll see what I mean. The way to tell a guard bee is that they have 6 legs, and guard bees stand at the entrance of the colony with their front 2 legs in the air. And almost when bees come in, that guard bee will kind of lunge at it and kind of touch it and then come back. And then kind of lunge at it and kind of touch it and then come back. And what they're doing is they're literally like, checking out their sisters coming in to see if they're sisters or not sisters. And if they don't pass the test, they get attacked. And then moving on from there, the bees that ultimately graduate 21 days old, roughly, become foragers. I told you they collect pollen, nectar, water, or saps or rosins. That's just what that says there. At this stage, the bees work themselves to death. This is the task that kills them if they make it this far. All right? So they work until their wings get tattered, or until they get eaten by a bird, or until they miss the entrance and hit the ground and ants get them, or whatever, until they get exposed to pesticides, whatever might kill bees in the field. Now, this is super important to learn because this is where we border beekeeping. Bees have two goals in life, right? First of all is to survive winter. The honeybees we keep, for the most part, are temperate honeybees, which means they're from Europe and they have to survive cold winters. And you live in a place that's kind of tropical, maybe subtropical is more officially what it is. In a subtropical area, there's plants blooming year-round. Where I live in High Springs, there's not plants blooming year-round. Colonies shut down. If you move to New York, they shut down from September through March. In High Springs, it shuts down December. Here, it may never shut down. But the skinny is that most colonies in the world that are Apis mellifera bees have to survive winter without incoming resources. That's why bees store honey. That's why they store honey. They have to survive winter in the absence of honey-producing plants, right? And so we try to manipulate that to cause them to store more honey than they need so that we can have some. That's beekeeping. So they want to survive winter. The other thing bees want to do is what most critters on the planet that are alive want to do. They want to reproduce. It is erroneous to believe that bees reproduce in bees. It is not a honeybee colony's goal in life to make more bees. If they did, colonies would just grow indefinitely, and that would be the end of it. Instead, because honeybees are social insects, they don't reproduce in bees, they reproduce in colonies. The colony is the reproductive unit. That is what they want to accomplish. They want to store honey and make more colonies. Period. So everything in them works towards doing this. This is their strongest desire, right? Having babies is a pretty strong desire, isn't it? You don't have to pretend, I know. Right? So the reason I point this out is because swarming is colony reproduction. And that's why swarming is so hard to stop. We're not very good at stopping a lot of things from reproducing, right? Because it's the strongest desire they have. So bees want to reproduce more than anything, but you might want to make honey more than anything, and the two of those kind of work against each other unless you just like making more colonies and swarms, which some people do, and that's fine too. So let's talk about this very briefly. When a honeybee colony is ready to swarm, they're going to produce new queens, and in essence what happens is about the old queen and roughly 30 to 70% of the workers come out of the nest. The queen does not make that decision. That is important to know. The queen does not say, it is time to swarm. The workers collectively say, it is time to swarm. They rush out of the colony with the queen. They all fly in the air, and wherever the queen lands, usually the most inconvenient place possible, the other 30 to 70% of the workers land with her in that cluster. We call that cluster a swarm. The process of doing this is swarming. So swarms swarm. It is a noun and a verb in the bee world. Swarm is not you being attacked by bees. That's funny. But this is a swarm. So in essence, when you watch a honeybee colony swarm, you are watching a colony give birth. This is a baby bee colony. Right? And so I was in Northern Ireland a couple years ago, and one of the world experts on this, and you've had him at your club, and I hope all of you were here, Tom Seeley. How many of you were here when Tom Seeley spoke? Tom Seeley's coming to our bee college this year, so he'll be back in Florida in a month. He's speaking probably on swarming. Did he speak about swarming while he was here? That's kind of his thing at the moment. Okay. So I was speaking in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and I'd gone through a lecture similar to this, and I mentioned this whole process of colony reproduction, and Tom Seeley came up to me. We were staying at the same house and drinking tea on the couch one night, and he said, Jamie, you know, the way you describe swarming is good, but I want you to think about it more like this. Colonies don't kind of reproduce like we do, in essence, that we give birth to a baby. He said colony swarm is a lot more, colony reproduction is a lot more like an apple tree reproduction. Did he tell you this analogy? It's kind of brilliant. It's very poetic. He said there are two ways that apple trees reproduce, contribute to reproduction. Don't say suckers. So with that off the table, What are the two ways that an apple tree contributes to reproduction? Seeds in the fruit that produce a new tree, and no, that's artificial. Pollination, I heard someone say it. Yeah, well, apple trees produce pollen to fertilize every other apple tree seeds, and they produce seeds. And you know what the stink is? The seed is no more genetically the tree than the pollen grain is. So to pollinate someone else's apples makes that tree as successful at getting its DNA out there as having its own apples fall from the tree. Give you a simple analogy. My beautiful wife carried all 4 of our kids for 9 months. For the next year of their life, all 4 of our kids, she nursed them. My wife's a stay-at-home mom. She nursed all 4 of them, fed them, took care of them, and cleaned them, and she pours all this love and affection into it, and they're still half me. Right? It doesn't matter if she grows them, if she feeds them, if she changes their diaper. They're as much me as they are her. Right? Genetically, they're as much me as they are her. Now, way to go, guys. All right, so how is that true for the honeybee colony? Well, the seed in here, this is the fruit. This is the fruit that falls from the tree that grows the new tree. What's the pollen that goes and fertilizes everybody else's seeds? Drones. So this colony is as successful producing swarms as it is producing drones mating with other people's queens. Right? So that's the 2 ways that honeybee colonies reproduce. They have their own seeds that make their own colonies, and they also produce pollen that goes and fertilizes everybody else's seeds. So, okay, back to swarming, back away from life. When they want to swarm, the colonies will construct queen cups. The queen will lay an egg in a cup. But incidentally, laying queens are too heavy to fly. So what happens is, since the worker bees control how much food they get, worker bees will withhold a little bit of feed from the queen. Some will get on her back and vibrate, which will cause her to run around the nest. And scientists have discovered that diet and exercise makes that queen lose weight. I mean, you think we'd get that, don't you? But no, we invent this and invent that. But diet and exercise helps the queen lose weight. When they get her down to her flying weight, which is really what it is. I mean, if you've been on an airplane, well, they'll come in and they'll shift one person to the front of the plane. It's like, what the heck? If we were that close to crashing with that dude on the back of the plane, it's like, can I at least get off? But you know what I'm talking about? That's the same thing. They're getting the queen down to flying weight. So she'll reduce her egg production. Workers will engorge and stop working. Why do the workers start taking in a lot of food? Because what do they have here? Each other and what's in their guts. Right? So they've got nothing except each other and what's in their guts. And they've got to go build a colony, provision it with enough food to survive the winter that in most temperate climates is just a few months away. Right down here, there is no winter. But in the rest of the world, it's just a few months away. And that's important because you can ask yourself, what leads to swarming? Well, congestion does. Right? When colonies get congested, that's a stimulus. The presence of males can stimulate colonies to swarm. Why? Because colonies are producing lots of females, so they also start producing lots of males. So the presence of a lot of drones is another stimulus for swarming. Seasonal nectar availability is a massive stimulus for swarming. Research has shown, well, let's just pretend that this is here. This is fictitious, but let's just say it's here. Let's just say in January you don't produce much nectar, and your major nectar flow is April, May, and a little bit of June. And this is true for most of the southeastern United States. And then it falls off, and if you're lucky and you got Brazilian pepper, you might go up here and whatever. It doesn't matter. So because of this curve, the swarms are most likely to happen right here. Why? Because that colony has to go from nothing to enough to survive winter, and they're going to swarm when the most amount of nectar is available. You're going to discover new beekeepers. Bees don't just produce honey year-round. You can't just go to your colonies anytime you want to and turn on a tap and honey come out and go into a jar. There are times to produce honey and harvest it, right? And this is the main time for most of the world. It may be shifted a couple months one way or the other, but this is what it looks like. Consequently, bees swarm here to maximize their access to resources. Research has shown the later in the season they swarm, the less likely that swarm is to survive winter, because there's just not enough time and enough resources to store up enough food to survive the oncoming cold. Of this simple paradigm, bees most want to swarm when you least want them to. Unless you are a swarm person, which again is okay, but the vast majority of beekeepers are not swarm people, so I'm preaching it from that perspective. So as a result, most beekeepers practice swarm control to stop this. But you're trying to stop the thing that bees want to do more than anything else, which is why no swarm control techniques are perfect. There you go. Biology sometimes has usefulness in real life. All right, so when do most swarms occur? I just told you. There's some impact of weather, daylight lengthening, etc. Older queens tend to swarm more than younger queens. Usually by the time you're getting ripe queen cells, and what we mean by that is there's a capping on the end, the colony then swarms. They swarm before the new queens emerge. It's very simple. If the old queen stayed behind, she'd fight the new queens. So the old queen, it's almost like the colony, once they determine that it's okay to leave because there's successors to their mom, then they swarm, right? So they recognize that and then go. This tells me it's too late, right? You'll learn to read a frame. This here means the new queen came out because it's opened on the tip. She went and bit holes into the side of these queen cells and killed her competition, who, by the way, are her sisters. And to make it more interesting is that these queens will pipe. It's actually kind of a toot when they're in the cells. So queens will go, bzzz, and the queens in the cells will respond. And she's like, where are you? And they're like, here we are. And she'll go and kill them. She literally calls to them, and they respond back, and she goes and gets them. It's crazy. Yes?
Don't they fight when they are completely already developed?
Yes.
Otherwise, they don't fight.
Sure. You mean in the cells? Yes.
And the bees are holding.
Yes, let me expand on that. So there's multiple purposes of piping. Sometimes the first queen out, the colony's strong enough to issue another swarm with that virgin queen. That's a secondary swarm. The first swarm left with the mated mom. So secondary swarm. So then bees can actually stay, the worker bees can control the release of queens, and then when the secondary swarm leaves, then they can release another one. And they oftentimes control subsequent releases of swarms and whether or not these workers will encounter each other. When they're done releasing queens, the workers contribute to the process of getting rid of their moms, or would be their sisters, but the colony's future mom. I'm speaking in way too much detail. I feel like I've spoken a long time. I know you guys are probably hating this, so I'm going to round this out quickly. Well, for everybody who wants to hear it, there's 3 people saying, please, seriously, shut up and sit down. So, trust me, I know. I've been doing this long enough. So, there's 2 points I want to make. Swarms, cells, usually occur on the perimeter of combs. They are purposeful. The bees want to do it. They construct queen cups. Queens lay eggs in those cups. That's an overgeneralization, but generally speaking, swarm cells occur on the periphery of combs. However, when they have an emergency, we call those queen cells supersedure cells. Either they're replacing a bad queen or they have no queen and they're making a new one. We call those supersedure cells. And generally speaking, supersedure cells are on the face of the comb. Because what has had to happen is it wasn't a purposeful, we weren't going to swarm, we just needed a queen. So we have to go to the youngest available female brood and divert it towards queendom. So what you tend to find is these supersedure cells are where the young brood is. Does that make sense? So as a result, the seasoned beekeeper, generally speaking, can look at queen cells and know, do I have a queen problem or do I have a colony wanting to swarm? You know, you can kind of read it based on it. It's not a perfect science, but it's pretty good once you really get seasoned. Bees, one of the things I like about bees is we are doctors. Beekeepers are doctors. We are. We're constantly going in and reading symptoms and trying to figure out how to respond to those. It's kind of a neat, we're everything actually. We're botanists and entomologists and doctors and lawyers because we oftentimes have to settle legal disputes with our neighbors. And anyway, all right, 2 more cool things that bees do. Number 1, they thermoregulate. When it's really cold outside, which I know never happens here, I know that's relative because I'm from Georgia, which is by no means a cold state. But up in North Florida, when it gets 40, everybody puts on jackets, and my parents up home are like still in shorts and T-shirts. So what's that temperature here? 72? All right. It's like I am burning up, and I know it's winter. Maybe it's because I'm animated right now. But when it's cold, boys and girls, the bees will cluster. Bees are cold-blooded, insects are cold-blooded. So individual bees are cold-blooded. They will unhinge their wings from their flight muscles, the head, thorax, abdomen. Abdomen's got all the guts. The head's got all the brain and the sensory information and some important glands. And their thorax is just a big ball of muscle. Everything that moves a bee is attached to the thorax. The 4 wings and the 6 legs are attached to the thorax. So the thorax is just muscle, right? So bees will unhinge their flight muscles from their wings and kind of vibrate those muscles and generate heat. And so what you do is you get this cluster of bees generating heat, heating the core of the colony. It doesn't matter what the temperature is outside. It's roughly 95 degrees in the center of that cluster. When it's cold, when it's hot outside, the bees will expand that cluster, station bees at the entrance of the nest that circulate air in and out of the nest. They'll have bees on the walls of the colony circulating air within the nest, and they'll cool off the colony. Incidentally, bees will forage for water and sprinkle droplets of water around the nest, which allows some evaporative cooling to happen off of those combs as well. I don't know if you appreciate what this simply means, but it doesn't matter if it's cold outside or hot outside. Most colonies' center of the brood nest is about 95 degrees. To put this in perspective, bees are cold-blooded, but honeybee colonies are warm-blooded. And that's a phenomenon of superorganisms, which is another talk that you've got to ask me to come down and give next year. So honeybee colonies are superorganisms, and at least honeybees colonies are warm-blooded. They thermoregulate, much like an animal does. So this is kind of what it looks like, schematic form. There we go.
What's the temperature when they don't have brood?
When they don't have brood, they can get pretty cold. They can get, down in the 70s or 60s, the center of that nest. The problem is kind of in the 60s. The question was, what's the temperature when they don't have brood? They can go to 60. The problem is around 60, because they're cold-blooded, they can get too cold to move. So oftentimes what you'll happen is you'll have kind of these freeze-outs when it's not cold outside. They'll have no brood. It'll be 60, so all the bees are nice and chilled, but it's not warm enough for them to kind of move to get food. So they can starve to death in this kind of suspended animation when there's food all around them. So you either really want it cold or you want it hot. That's that weird middle temperature that can be a problem. And incidentally, keeping with that, when they form this cluster, the bees on the outside of that cluster actually get too cold to go back in. So they get so cold that their workers in the middle have to pull them back in and replace them when they're trying to keep this cluster warm. So the last thing that I'll tell you about, which is what a lot of people outside the bee world know about bees, is the dancing. There are 3 types of dances, 3 main types of dances that bees do. There's a circle dance, a figure 8 dance, and then the range between the circle and figure 8. In essence, the circle dance communicates to the other bees that food is roughly between the colony and about 50 feet out, 15 meters or so, right? Or so, it's not on this slide. Yeah, 15 meters. So roughly between the colony and 15 meters, there's food. It does not communicate direction. It does kind of communicate quality. The vigor with which the bee is doing that circle communicates good food source, relatively close. Here's what it tastes like. Go get it, right? Now the figure 8 dance, the waggle dance, the wagtail dance, it goes by a number of different names, communicates food that's about 100 meters from the nest, so about a football field or further from the nest. So that's important because the round dance begins to open up in that little 15 meter to 100 meter distance, and the closer you get to 100 meters, the more it looks like a figure 8. The closer you get to 15 meters, the more it looks like a circle, right? So it's a transitional dance is what we call it, and it's weird. Okay, so I'm just going to pick on the 2 that we kind of understand a lot. The figure 8 dance is the one that most people know about. The person who interpreted this won a Nobel Prize. He's currently the only honeybee person to ever win a Nobel Prize. And what he found, and I guess I am going to use the board, what he found is on the average comb, let's make sure this is dry erase. I mean, it's kind of too late, but I don't work here, so it's y'all's problem. All right, so on a comb, the sun is always up. And that's important because in the dance, there is a straight run, right? The relative of that straight run, the relative position of that straight run to up communicates the direction of the food source to the sun. For example, if they go straight run up and around, straight run up and around, straight run up, what they're telling their sisters who are watching is that the food source is directly in the direction of the sun. If they go straight run down and around, straight run down and around, straight run down and around, they're telling their watching sisters, go out, find the sun, and go the exact opposite direction. Right? If they're dancing 60 degrees to the right of up, the food source is 60 degrees to the right of the sun. You get it? So the direction of the angle tells where the food source is. The vigor with which they shake tells how far it is and what good of quality it is. This can be so interpreted that the really good people who can do this can mark the dancing bees, interpret what they're saying, and go wait at the bush for them to show up without knowing where they came from. Literally just interpreting it from the dancing bee. You have to be good. I've never tried it, but the guy who did it won a Nobel Prize. So in essence, this is some examples. Dancing straight up, the bees go out and fly in the direction of the sun. 60 degrees to the left, the food source is 60 degrees to the left. 120 degrees to the right, the food source is 120 degrees to the right. Straight down, straight away. That's basically what all that means. Now, it's even more fascinating than that because you've got to remember bees live in a dark hive. Their sisters aren't watching them. If you actually watch the dance, the sisters will kind of dance with them. So they're probably learning it that way. In addition, and most people don't know this, there are 3 functions of wax. Most people can only tell me one function. And they'll say they store honey and they store brood and they store pollen. Congratulations, you told me one function, storage. The second function, which I'm not talking about tonight, is that wax is very important in handling of waste in colonies. But the third function is bees use wax to communicate. The dancing bee will stop in that straight run and send vibrations out through the comb that as long as the dance watchers have at least 3, let's call them feet, on the wax, they can pick up information from that wax, triangulate the position of the dancing bee, and receive information that way. So while bees are in the field and the sun moves, they can account for that based on how long they're in the field. How they do that, we don't know, and use the sun. If they're out an hour and the sun's moved a lot, they can adjust their flight appropriately to get right back to the hive every time. So the question was what happens when we don't use pure beeswax foundation and we use plasticell foundation, which means the center of that comb is hard plastic rather than beeswax like the bees would have made it. Tom Seeley is the one who did the work on that. He didn't talk about it here. I think what he hypothesized is that it was going to make a major difference, and I think he found it made a difference, but the colonies did not suffer as a result. So bees found a way to overcompensate in other ways, which incidentally is one of the reasons queens mate with multiple males. Somebody's going to figure it out. All right? I could go on for days. That's a little bit, a teeny tiny little bit about bee biology, but hopefully the best beekeepers, this is not hopefully, this is true, the best beekeepers know the most about bee biology because you learn to manage the bees according to what they do. So it's been a long time. I was supposed to start at 6:30, so it's been, I don't know, an hour and a half. So what I'll do is I'll take 5 questions. That way whoever wants to leave, well, you guys can do whatever you need to do, and I'll just stay until you ask me questions one-on-one. That seems fair, right? So people who need to go can, and then otherwise go. So first question, second question, third question. Actually, you've asked a few, so I'm going to let some other people ask some, okay? Does that sound fair? To me it does at least. All right, so first.
With the secondary swarm, when they leave with the virgin,
Sure.
when do they mate?
Question was is if they leave, if they swarm secondarily or tertiarily with a virgin, when does she mate? She mates when she gets to the new colony. When they establish a new nest in a new location, she goes out and mates from there.
Okay. Somebody told me that she mates while they're hanging there.
The comment was that someone told them they mate while they hang in the swarm. They do not.
I mean, they leave and come back.
The virgins leave from the swarm and come back? No, they don't do that. It's because most swarms will only stay there a couple hours as long as there's a good nest site. Well, they can stay for a week, but that's only when there's no good nest sites out there available. So there was a question over here that was number 2.
Yeah, the queen cells, queen cups.
Yep,
Okay, they hang.
yep.
Why doesn't everything fall out of them?
I don't know. The Earth's spinning. I don't know. Centripetal force is forcing them up as the Earth's turning. I mean, if you do an extractor, I don't know. I just made that up. It's probably surface tension.
Surface tension?
Probably, right? It's a sticky, wet critter sitting in a big, sticky, thick fluid. Yeah, I mean, that's my guess. And I'm not a physicist. If you're number 5, I'll get to you. All right? Yes, sir.
The drone congregation area.
Yep.
What are they looking for the congregation?
Good question. Questions, what are drones looking for in DCAs? Okay, so my German colleagues who are the world experts on mating behavior study drone DCAs in Germany where there's mountains everywhere. So they believed that what they were looking for, there's a mountain here, there's a mountain here, a mountain here, a mountain here. They believed that drones kind of flew towards what they call depressions in the horizon, right? And so they would say which basically would put them on the edge of fields. So fly in this direction, you're eventually going to get to an edge of a field, and that's where they will do it. Now, but the problem is, when they started telling us this, and we were looking for DCAs in Florida, we don't have any mountains. We don't even have any hills. Although I did ride by 2 on the turnpike here, but there are a lot of buzzards circling those, and I didn't see any depressions in the horizon. So what they tend to do is they tend to show up at the edges of wood lines and in fields. And you can find them real easily. And I had a student who did research on DCAs, and what you do is you put up a weather balloon, and you can buy cigarette filters that are untreated, basically the cotton, and you can impregnate them with queen pheromone, and you walk around with a balloon in the air until drones start chasing you. And when drones chase you, congratulations, you found a DCA.
Is it true though that the drones will fly like 2 meters
The question is it true that in the best case scenario there's different flight differentials for queens and drones? The answer is yes. Drones typically fly about half a kilometer from the nest. Queens usually fly about 2 kilometers from the nest. Biology's messy. Those are rough averages. But that's probably an attempt to keep the queens from mating with their related drones. But obviously in the absence of drones, except those from your colonies, that's who she ends up with. So 2 more questions. I know I saw one. Yes, sir?
Basic overall question about beekeeping, which got me interested in it overall.
Yep.
Quick question. Meaning of life?
42. Did you get that? Okay. Oh, yeah, so what's the meaning of life? Oh my gosh. All right. Talk to me afterwards. I'm a Christian, so I'm going to answer that one way exclusively. So, but if you're a Douglas Adams fan, it's 42. So I'll give you the 5th question. Yes, sir.
In the spring, well, in Florida,
Mm-hmm.
because the winter is not hot, we do have hives
Sure.
that have drones
Mm-hmm.
that came out from
Sure.
bee cells,
Sure.
and also that from laying workers,
Mm-hmm.
and also from queens that are laying unfertilized eggs.
Sure.
So in the beginning of the year, when the area doesn't have good drones, it's a lot of
In-
drones this time.
Sure.
Is this affecting, of course, the quality, because is this curve of those drones,
Good question. All right. So,
is it
yep.
alive?
That's a good question. So, believe it or not, there's not been a tremendous amount of research on drone sperm. I mean, the people who study drone sperm claim that there's a lot of information out there, but there's not. Scientists currently believe, with no good compelling reason to, but they currently believe that laying worker drones are fully capable of fertilizing queens and producing viable offspring. They tend to be a little smaller, just physically a little smaller, because workers will deposit eggs everywhere. And so a lot of the laying worker drones are coming out of worker-sized cells. You put a small goldfish in a small fish tank, it stays a small fish. It's the same thing. If you lay a drone egg in a worker cell, it's a small drone. So the current belief is that laying worker drones are just as good as non-laying worker drones. I'm not convinced of that, but that's the current consensus. So now your comment is, maybe in a warmer climate where queens are running out of semen and produce drones exclusively, are those drones just as good as when she purposely produced drones? The answer is probably yes. I mean, the real question is are those drones that are hanging around this time of year produced drones, or are they leftover and just never killed because it never got cold? And in that case, old drones can have reduced sperm loads. Drones that grow up in cells that have too much pesticides in them can have reduced sperm loads. So there's increasing amount of research going into the quality of drones at DCAs. Just because a drone can make it to a DCA doesn't mean it's a good drone. So there's a whole lot of work going on pathogen and pesticide impacts on drones producing viable sperm. And so there's a lot of questions out there. Queens may be mating with a lot of drones, but just a lot of bad drones and coming back poorly mated, even though they're abundantly mated. But that's a lot of conjecture at the moment. Hopefully people will know the answer to that better someday. So I'm going to stop so you get back to your business purposes. But I want to say before I go, the biggest event that we put on every year is our UFB college. We have 3 now. We have the normal one, which is up in North Florida. We have about 300 beekeepers go to that. We have a South Florida one down in Fort Lauderdale. Maybe some of you came to that. It's about 150. We also do one in the Caribbean every year. This year it's in Grenada. But our one is coming up in a month, and Tom Seeley is speaking at that. I know he was here, but if you not, he's speaking a lot at our meeting. So I've got handouts for our bee college. For those of you who've never been to a bee college, it's a 2-day crash course for the people who don't know anything about bees, from building equipment and growing bees, etc., to people to instrumentally inseminating queens, to all the more advanced topics. So there's something for everybody at the bee college. So I'm just going to pass the flyers around. You don't have to come. We'll be down here in August. But the North Florida Bee College is generally the biggest one with the most amount of speakers, just because there's more people who come. And when more people come, we can do more stuff. So I'm going to just pass those around and then turn it over to whoever I need to turn it over to. Thank you guys so much for your attention. I really appreciate it.